Mick Jagger leans into the microphone, his eyes darting toward the wings of the stage, where Ed Sullivan stands with his arms crossed like a stone-faced warden. The drums are hitting hard. The bass is thumping through the floorboards of Studio 50. Then the moment happens. Instead of the rebellious, gritty line, "Let's spend the night together," Jagger lets out a sarcastic, exaggerated, "Let's spend some time together," while visibly rolling his eyes into the back of his skull. It was a 1967 car crash, captured on live television. This wasn't just a lyric change. It was a PR suicide mission that backfired so spectacularly, it nearly burnt the entire network's reputation to the ground. The truth is, Sullivan thought he was cleaning up rock and roll, but he actually handed the Rolling Stones the ultimate badge of outlaw credibility. You're going to want to know what I expose next about the secret contracts involved, so subscribe now so you don't miss it. Sullivan was terrified of the FCC and the mountain of angry letters from suburban parents, but his attempt at damage control created a censorship infection that spread across every major radio station in America within 48 hours. Suddenly, every program director was scrambling to scrub suggestive content, creating a sterile, fake version of the counterculture that the fans immediately adulterated contempt on Keith Richards' face as he slams his guitar strings. They knew they were being neutered for a paycheck. This is where the polished image of the 1960s cracks wide open. A subscription here is a quiet rebellion against the noise of corporate-approved history. Behind the scenes, the moment those cameras cut to a commercial, the air in the room turned ice cold. Because Jagger's eye roll made the host look like a puppet. The Stones didn't just break a rule, they mocked the man who made the rules. The PR team was in a full-blown panic in the hallways, screaming into landline phones, trying to figure out how to spin a compromise that looked like a total surrender. Follow the money. Sullivan's sponsors were threatening to pull out if the filth continued. But the irony is that the controversy sold more records than the actual song ever could have on its own. The infection of corporate fear had reached its peak, and the fallout was about to get physical. In the dressing room, the mood wasn't celebratory. It was war. The Stones felt the sting of being handled, and they were ready to bite back. Sullivan's family-friendly stage had just become the birthplace of the most profitable rivalry in music history. The PR disaster was only beginning, and it was about to get much, much messier. Look at the red-on air light flickering off. The silence in Studio 50 wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. You think Mick Jagger was smiling when he walked off that stage? He wasn't. He was vibrating with a specific kind of corporate-induced rage that would define the next decade of rock and roll. Think about the physical space of that studio. The smell of stale tobacco and heavy floor wax. The technicians were literally trembling as they coiled up the thick black cables because they knew the boss was about to explode. Ed Sullivan wasn't just a host. He was the gatekeeper to the American living room, and the Rolling Stones had just spray-painted his front door. The infection of panic didn't stay in that room. It traveled through the phone lines like a virus. By 9 a.m. the next morning, every major record executive in Manhattan was sitting in a leather chair, sweating through their expensive shirts. They weren't talking about art. They were talking about the moral hazard clauses in their contracts. Follow the money. If the sponsors walked, the labels collapsed. It's that simple. You sitting there might think censorship is a thing of the past, but this was the blueprint. They started drafting the clean list, a set of rules so strict it made the Victorian era look like a rave. Every lyric was scrutinized under a magnifying glass by men who didn't even like music. They wanted the money, but they hated the messenger. The reality of the situation was a total mess. While the newspapers were calling it a harmless compromise, the actual internal memos were calling for the Stones to be banned from US soil. It was a Cold War, fought with press releases and secret meetings in dimly lit steakhouses. Jagger knew he'd been played, and he spent the entire night in a hotel room, pacing back and forth, planning his next move to dismantle the very system that just paid him. This wasn't a win for the counterculture. It was a warning shot that the industry would rather mute your voice than lose a nickel from a soap company. The ripple effect hit every garage band in America within weeks. If you wanted to be on TV, you had to play the game, or you had to be willing to burn the whole stadium down. The Stones chose to play the game just long enough to get the keys to the kingdom, and then they changed the lock. Performers after that night. Tighter shots, more control, more safe angles. They were terrified of another eye roll, another smirk, another moment of raw human truth breaking through the plastic. The infection was total. It wasn't just about one song anymore. It was about who owned the culture. And for a long time, the answer was the guys in the suits who were currently screaming at their secretaries. But here is the part they don't want you to know. The censorship didn't kill the Stones' career. It weaponized it. They realized that being the villains was 10 times more profitable than being the darlings. While Sullivan was busy answering angry letters from parents in Ohio, the Stones were already in the studio recording their next middle finger to the establishment. The tension in that dressing room had shifted from fear to a cold, calculating ambition. They saw the blueprint of the machine and decided they were going to be the ones to jam the gears. The PR teams were trying to play checkers while the band was playing chess with the entire world's attention span. Every single controversy from that point on was curated. It was manufactured chaos designed to drive the very people who hated them into a frenzy, knowing that for every angry parent, there were 10 teenagers with $1 in their pocket and a desire to see the world burn. The infection of fear had successfully crossed over from the boardroom to the bedroom of every teenager in the country. Now, the stakes were even higher. The next time they went on air, it wouldn't be a compromise. It would be an ambush. The industry was scrambling to catch up, but the Stones were already 10 miles ahead, laughing all the way to the bank, while the suits were still trying to figure out how to censor a feeling. The fallout of that night at Studio 50 wasn't just a footnote in music history. It was the moment the industry lost control of the narrative. The era of the clean-cut rock star was dead, and the era of the outlaw had just been born on a live broadcast in front of millions. If you think the "let's spend the night together" incident was just about a lyric change, you're missing the entire war. It was about the physical possession of the airwaves. It was about who had the balls to stare into a lens and lie to the face of the most powerful man in television just to prove a point. And the point was made. The industry reacted by tightening the leash. But all they did was ensure that when the leash finally snapped, the explosion would be loud enough to change the world forever. The infection was deep. It was permanent. And it was about to turn the entire entertainment world into a battlefield where the only rule was that there were no rules. You need to understand that the panic in the CBS hallways wasn't just about morality. It was about the terrifying realization that they couldn't control the icons they had created. The product had gained a consciousness, and it was hostile. This is where the story gets even darker, because the backlash wasn't just limited to TV studios. The FBI started taking notes. Local police departments started showing up at concerts with noise meters and handcuffs. The corporate fear had officially militarized. Every single show the Stones played after that was a potential riot. The air in the arenas was thick with the smell of rebellion and cheap perfume. You can practically see the sweat dripping off the walls in the archival footage. It wasn't a concert, it was a standoff. And every time Jagger moved, the police moved closer to the stage. It was a physical manifestation of the censorship that had started in Sullivan's office. The infection had reached the streets, and there was no turning back now. Follow the trail of broken equipment and torn-up theater seats. That's where the real history is written. The industry tried to sanitize the mess, but you can't clean up a revolution with a press release. The more they tried to suppress it, the more it mutated. The Stones weren't just a band anymore. They were a symptom of a much larger breakdown in the social contract. And the best part? They were getting paid millions to watch it happen. The corporate world was accidentally funding its own destruction, and they were too greedy to stop it. They kept booking the band because the ratings were too good to ignore, even as the band was metaphorically setting the studio on fire. It was the ultimate irony. The censors were the ones providing the platform for the very thing they were trying to kill. The infection had become the lifeblood of the industry. The very thing that made the executives lose sleep was the only thing keeping them in business. It was a parasitic relationship that would define the next 50 years of pop culture. Every time you see a celebrity do something shocking today, remember that it all started with a simple eye roll and a dirty look in a New York TV studio. That was the patient zero of the viral age. And we are still living with the symptoms today. The truth is, Sullivan thought he was saving his reputation, but he was actually just building the pedestal for the people who would eventually replace him. The power had shifted, and it was never going back to the men in the gray suits. The infection had won. The PR teams were in a total tailspin, trying to explain why a group of guys they called hoodlums were suddenly the most famous people on the planet. They released frantic statements, claiming the lyrics were just misunderstood. But the fans in the front row knew exactly what they were hearing. You can see the panic in the blurry archival photos of network executives staring at the ratings charts with their mouths hanging open. They were making millions of dollars, while their moral authority was being flushed down the toilet in real time. Look at the grainy footage of the press conferences from that week. You see men in grey suits, sweating under hot studio lights, stuttering as they try to justify the chaos to angry parents. Teenagers were literally ripping the clothes off their idols in the streets, and the police were swinging batons just to keep the stage from collapsing. It wasn't just a PR disaster anymore, it was a total meltdown of the old world order. The truth is, every time the media called the band dangerous, the ticket sales doubled by the next morning. It was a feedback loop of pure adrenaline that nobody in a boardroom knew how to stop. If seeing how a single PR disaster changed the music industry forever gave you a new perspective on modern fame, go ahead and subscribe right now. They thought they could manage the situation by putting a filter on the camera, but the infection was already in the bloodstream of every kid watching at home. Now, look at the celebrity landscape today. Every stage scandal and every leaked video follows the blueprint the Stones accidentally created in that New York studio. There are even darker stories behind the scenes of these classic clips that the networks still try to bury today. Sullivan died thinking he was the king of television, but he was actually just the guy who held the door open for the people who burned his house down. The game is finished. The board is locked. The music is still playing, and the suits are long gone. Checkmate. The fallout wasn't just a few angry phone calls. It was a total demolition of the industry's golden rules. Look at the stacks of lawsuits piling up on corporate desks the very next morning. The lawyers were sweating through their expensive shirts, realizing that the old contracts were now worthless pieces of paper. They tried to put the genie back in the bottle by forcing artists to sign morality clauses, but it was way too late. The infection had already jumped from the television screens into the brains of every teenager with a pulse. You could see the change in the way record stores looked. Those once clean aisles were suddenly filled with bands trying to outshock each other just to get a mention on the nightly news. The PR firm started hiring fixers whose only job was to spin disasters into profit. It turned the entire music business into a giant machine fueled by outrage. Imagine the scene in the weeks following that broadcast. You have parents literally burning record covers in their backyards, the black smoke rising into the suburban sky, while their kids are hiding the same albums under their mattresses. This wasn't a debate. It was a cultural civil war. The music industry saw the fire and decided to pour gasoline on it. They started planting fake stories in the tabloids, staging accidental arrests, and leaking secret photos to keep the momentum going. It was the birth of the modern hype cycle. The infection spread into the very way we consume fame today. Every time you see a celebrity mistake go viral, you are looking at the ghost of that first PR disaster. They turned the scandal into the product. But here is the part they never tell you. Those artists weren't rebels. They were employees doing exactly what the numbers told them to do. The rebellion was sold back to you at a premium price. Every subscription